People will probably have seen the results by now that the socialist François Hollande came out on top of the first round poll and looks likely to win the second round of the French elections on the 6th of May. He narrowly defeated the incumbent president Nicolas Sarkozy. But the big story of the first round vote is the massive vote, around 6.4 million votes for the fascist organisation, the Front National. There was also a good score for the radical left candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who'd run the most dynamic campaign, and I think many people were disappointed that 11% didn't seem to reflect the echo that Mélenchon had got in wider French society for policies that were clearly anti-austerity and for redistribution of wealth. What I want to do is go into some of the detail about the vote and argue that what the first round demonstrates is an intense polarisation of politics in French society. A lot of the reports that people will have seen, I think, are very complacent about the vote for the Front National. The question that I asked, I was in Paris on the night of the election, why was it that hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets between the two rounds of the election in 2002, when Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie, came second for the Front National in that election? Why is it that when more people vote for the Front National, there are no demonstrations? Why is it that you see articles in The Guardian saying we shouldn't really worry too much about this because the actual percentage score isn't quite as high as the cumulative vote for the extreme right in 2002? I think this is very dangerous, and what we're dealing with, I think, is the rise of an extreme right that has developed under the presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy, who has waged the most racist agenda of any modern French president. And so we're dealing with a backdrop of austerity led by the racist agenda of what I would call the extreme centre, and the extreme right has grown out of this. So I want to talk first of all a little bit about the climate that has been created that laid the basis for this vote for the Front National. And essentially what we've seen over the last 5 years is a transition on the mainstream right, where Nicolas Sarkozy has presented himself as an authoritarian populist figure who made a name for himself by denigrating the black and Arab youth of the banlieue as racailles, so as a dirty rabble or scum, and he said we will clean these areas out with a power hose, and having made his name on that basis, was elected president in 2007 and immediately set about reviving the language of colonialism. He went to Dakar, made a speech where he apologised for the crimes of colonialism, but then pointed out all the good things that colonialism had brought to Africa: the bridges, the roads, the hospitals, a little bit like what have the Romans ever done for us? A little bit like that Monty Python sketch. And then he went on to say, the African man has never entered into history, has never experienced human adventure or progress, because he lives a life that is rhythmed by the seasons, rhythmed by nature. And then he went through a whole list of Africa's problems. Africa lives too much in the past. Africa dwells too much on its problems. And he said to this audience of intellectuals, researchers, students, do you really want to stop hunger in Africa? Do you really want that not a single person more dies of starvation? And so he reveals to them the solution that he was bringing to them all the way from France, which was his suggestion that Africans should produce their own food. And so this, it was like something out of the most racist 19th century colonial racism. And then they set about, in government, reviving this colonial legacy, ruthlessly stigmatizing Muslims, Roma people, and immigrants. Laws were passed banning the wearing of the niqab or the burqa in public. They passed laws that banned Muslims from praying in the street, and there are moves underfoot now to ban the wearing of the headscarf in public transport. So there are also cases of mothers who wear the headscarf being refused permission to accompany their children on school trips. So this ruthless stigmatizing of Muslims and of Islam has been accompanied by the setting of quotas for the deporting of illegal immigrants. Tens of thousands of illegal immigrants have been deported under the Sarkozy presidency, and the brutal dismantling of Roma camps. And all of this accompanied by an intensely racist language, unprecedented really in its consistency and its tone in modern French political life. When the riots broke out in 2006, there was a debate about employment. And this is a country where graduate unemployment stands at about 5%. For North African graduates, it stands at 26%. You're much more likely to leave school if you're of African origin in France with no qualifications than if your parents are French. You're much more likely, if you have qualifications from a North African background, to wind up unemployed than if your parents are French. And against this backdrop, mainstream politicians churned out arguments like, well, the reason why young North Africans aren't employed is because they're rowdy, they're prone to crime. This is because there are so many polygamous families in France, and when there's an absent father, this drives people to delinquency. Sarkozy whipped up, following Marine Le Pen's lead, whipped up a storm during the election, tried to create a moral panic about halal meat. The Interior Minister said if we give Muslims the vote, they'll impose halal meat in school canteens across France. Sarkozy said this is the main preoccupation of the French people, halal meat, at a time when France, like the rest of Europe, is experiencing the greatest economic crisis since the 1930s. The Interior Minister earlier this year talked about a clash of civilizations, talked about the progressive nature of French civilization compared to other civilizations which don't respect women. In other words, that's how we wanted to characterize Islam, and went on to say we have to acknowledge that some civilizations are more superior than others and should be protected. So in other words, the language of the Front National, the language that up to this point, up to the Sarkozy presidency, had been denounced pretty much across the political spectrum as racist. Former Prime Minister Jacques Chirac made speeches about the noise and the smell of immigrants, but still would say the Front National has a deep-seated fault line. These people are racist. That stigmatisation of the Front National has disappeared, and what we've got is a situation where people can go on television and the radio, as one editorialist did a few years ago, and say, I have to admit I'm a bit of an Islamophobe. Claude Ambert, who writes for Le Point magazine, actually sits on the High Council of Integration and received no rebuke or sanction for his remarks. So we have a situation now where Sarkozy is fighting to get into the second round. So he's attempting to deepen the populist direction that he's taken his politics in. He's called on his supporters to join a demonstration on the 1st of May, claiming that unions don't represent workers anymore. As many claim that he thinks the Front National is compatible with the Republic. And the rise in the vote of the Front National is really attributable to the climate of Islamophobia that's been deliberately stoked up by the mainstream right. The mainstream right and the rest of the mainstream political establishment's inability to deal with austerity measures that has allowed this millionaire's daughter, Marine Le Pen, to masquerade as some kind of opponent of austerity. And I think what's happening here is about the transformation of the mainstream right that used to be dominated by Gaullism. And Gaullism had a strong emphasis on the social aspect of the state, drew a lot on its historical links with the resistance. And this, over the last 20 to 30 years, has been replaced, this outlook has been replaced by a much more overt neoliberal outlook. Francis Fukuyama once said that what France lacks is an enforcer figure like Thatcher or Reagan. In other words, somebody to enthusiastically articulate market values and affiliation to the free market. Sarkozy set himself up as that figure, as the enforcer, the man who would break with the compromises of the past. But there's no popular enthusiasm for neoliberalism. There's nothing comparable to what we saw in Britain in the 1980s, where the idea that buying your own shares or buying your own council house was in some way a good thing. And therefore the rhetoric of neoliberalism rests on a kind of vague identification with modernisation, but not really much enthusiasm for the free market and entrepreneurialism and so on. And so it relies on racism, it relies on the pointing out of problems in French society, relies on negative political campaigning, which reinforces the authority of the state in a penal sense. The state must be there to deal with crime, to deal with immigration, and not in a social sense. And so the problem that Sarkozy is faced with is, having set himself up as the man who would get tough on immigration, because immigration was held to be responsible for crime and unemployment, what we've seen is that the conditions that austerity produces haven't got rid of unemployment or crime. So however tough he gets on immigration, he's not going to resolve the problem. So that kind of demagogic rhetoric, when you're an outsider candidate, might work, as it works for the FN. When you're actually in power, supposedly sorting out all these problems, that rhetoric simply becomes the perpetual demonstration of your own impotence to deal with those problems. And that's partly what has developed a hardline alternative to Sarkozyism on the far right. It's not simply the rhetoric about immigration, it's the authoritarianism of the organisation, the sense that here's an organisation that will really sort things out and deal with problems because they have an outsider status that sets them apart from the elite. So I think part of the explanation for the Socialist Party vote is that this is the best placed candidate to beat Sarkozy. But I think what we see with the Socialist vote is a residual attachment to the values of solidarity that the Socialist Party used to represent, but which through its policies is actually undermining. So it's a very fragile basis of support for the Socialist Party. And although I think Hollande will win in the second round, his status really is as the man who isn't Sarkozy. He promises to return to a normal presidency, different from the kind of bling-bling lifestyle that Sarkozy paraded around the world. Most of the measures proposed by the socialists to deal with austerity are symbolic. They're not going to affect things in a big way. Hollande himself says that his programme represents fair austerity, so a kind of oxymoronic programme. But the crisis, the deep-seated nature of the crisis and its effects has largely been absent from the campaign, and I think this is partly why the Mélenchon campaign did strike such a chord with people, because it spoke much more directly and much more effectively about the crisis. I'll say something about Mélenchon in a moment, but what the Socialist Party is going to do between the two rounds is make a pitch for Front National votes. A leading socialist yesterday talked about the Socialist Party line on immigration and compared it to the Front National line on immigration. And he pointed out that Marine Le Pen says France needs 100,000 immigrants to work in France. He said she's acknowledged that students should be allowed to come and study in France, and that people who get married and get French citizenship that way should also be allowed to stay. So he says, on the one hand, you see Marine Le Pen acknowledges there have to be immigrants, and then he says, when Sarkozy says immigration must be stopped, I won't point the finger at him. And then he said, there is therefore a consensus on immigration between the Front National, the UMP, Sarkozy's party, and the Socialist Party. So this is unprecedented, really, for leading socialist politicians to speak in a positive light about the FN line on immigration. This is a party whose programme talks about giving 10,000 residence papers every year. So it talks about a much bigger clampdown than what Sarkozy is proposing. Sarkozy is proposing to halve immigration. And what the Front National has attempted to do is, having got only 10% of the vote in 2007, to claw its way back into the mainstream by presenting a much more respectable image. So the fact that it's Marine Le Pen and not her father. So her father, the man who talked about the Holocaust as a detail of the Second World War, the man who talked about we have to recognise there is racial inequality, there's inequality between races, who had this image as a much more extreme figure. The press have taken the fact that she's a woman and that she's distancing herself mildly from some of the things that her father said, that this is somehow a much more respectable party. So the idea that the daughter of the leading French fascist of the post-war period is somehow carrying out a kind of democratic coup against her father is ridiculous. This is a woman who on the 27th of January, so the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, went to a ball in Vienna organised by the Olympia group, which is a far right-wing student organisation that bans Jews and bans women from taking part, and she went and celebrated with them as the guest of the Austrian Freedom Party, the party that Jörg Haider used to lead. Jean-Marie Le Pen paid tribute during the election campaign to Robert Brasillach, so a collaborator who called on Jews to be shot during the war. The polls that have come out, the sociological breakdown of the votes have shown that, among other things, the vast majority of Front National voters consider themselves to be on the far right of the political spectrum, consider themselves to be very right-wing, are for cutting the budget deficit. So this party has been allowed to masquerade as an opponent of austerity. What it represents is a hardline fascist pole of opposition to mainstream politics that's being legitimised on a consistent basis by that mainstream. So just to end, I want to say a few things about the Mélenchon campaign, the campaign of the Left Front. They organised an incredible series of rallies during the election campaign. 120,000 people at the Bastille on the anniversary of the Paris Commune on the 18th of March, 70,000 people in Toulouse, 120,000 people in Marseille. I went to a meeting last Thursday night, the biggest indoor venue I've ever seen, like a kind of aircraft hangar, 60,000 people in the meeting. And Mélenchon made a very inspiring speech, talked about how the rich have a class consciousness, how we must have our own class consciousness, talked about how the accumulation of wealth is incompatible with democracy, talked about the mean-spirited determination of the proponents of austerity to grab every penny that we need for our small pleasures, and talked about how neoliberalism doesn't speak a human language. And it's really a campaign that gave a tremendous amount of confidence to people in articulating the arguments about why austerity is wrong and why and how people can start clawing back the money that has been robbed from the poor by the rich over the last 30 years. He talked about how production was on the rise and how austerity, the logic behind austerity was a lie, and said, you don't owe them anything, they owe you everything. And so the Mélenchon campaign, Mélenchon got just over 11% of the vote. The total radical left vote was slightly down on the total in the last elections. In terms of votes, it's a very high number of people. It's over 3 million people who are voting for radical left policies. And I think what Mélenchon represents is the radical left dynamic that has emerged over the last 10 or 20 years. It's the expression of many, many years of struggle, but it's also the expression of where that struggle is at the moment. The defeat of the campaign over pensions in 2010 has left its mark, and I think there's an element of support for Mélenchon that is about delegating somebody to act on our behalf. Nevertheless, the campaign itself does offer the potential for structuring the kind of movement that will be needed in the future. So the last 2 points are: whoever wins the election, there will be an employers' offensive. There have already been noises made by representatives of the employers saying France has to deal with its deficit. The markets don't have infinite patience. So there is going to be a need for a movement of industrial and political struggle, and it's hoped that the Front de Gauche, the Left Front, will be able to punch its way in that struggle and offer a genuine political alternative that goes beyond elections. The new anti-capitalist party got a small vote, got 1%, is going through a whole lot of internal problems. And I think the question for revolutionaries in France is, where are we most effective? And there's a debate about whether there's a need for a clear anti-capitalist pole outside the Left Front, or whether it would be better organised within the Left Front. The Left Front is an alliance of former socialists and communists, and we'll see over the next few weeks how that is going to be structured. But alongside developing that movement to take on the fight against austerity is a need to take on the Front National, to see it as a specific threat that is distinct from populist right-wing mainstream racism, that it's a different organisation, that they're trying to build a fascist current and therefore need obstructing and breaking. There are examples of the left in France taking on the Front National, and there are examples of them getting results and causing splits in the organisation, but that will also require the left to break from the perversion of the idea of Republican secularism that has developed over the last couple of decades. The idea that this tradition has something to do with the state telling Muslims what they should wear or where they should pray, that has to be taken on, and that tide of Islamophobia has to be stemmed if the Front National is going to be stopped and if it's going to be prevented from sowing divisions among a movement that needs to be united if it's going to succeed. On the United Front stuff, there's been an argument all along that the FN isn't fascist, that it's different, that's taken what they've said at face value, about accepting democracy, accepting the Republic. And I think this has meant that until the late 1980s, there wasn't a concerted campaign to confront the FN. And this was partly because once it made its electoral breakthrough, it got a huge number of votes and it got representation in Parliament. And once you get to that stage, we've seen it with the kind of arguments around Nick Griffin and appearing on Question Time and so on. There's a defeatism that sets in. But there were campaigns in the late 80s and early 90s around two organisations, Roi le Front and the Manifeste contre le Front National, which, in the case of Roi le Front, labelled the FN as fascist, said they must be taken on. The Manifeste contre le Front National, the Manifesto against the Front National, talked about the democratic harassment of the organisation. And so you had lots of examples. Remember the regional election campaign in '92, where the FN would fly to places like Martinique. People would lay down on the runway and prevent the planes from landing. In Corsica, they stopped Le Pen from holding a demonstration, huge crowds of protesters outside. And then in '97, there was a big demonstration of tens of thousands of people that marched through Strasbourg, where the FN was holding its congress. So there are examples of the French left uniting and confronting the FN, and this brought out internal divisions in the party, and it meant a lot of their cadre left after the split. So the organisation has been weakened. The organisation before the split was attempting to root itself in housing estates, in kind of satellite organisations that tried to sink roots in wider society. And Le Pen at the time of the split said, we have to make good the gap between our 5 million votes and our 50,000 members. So there was an attempt to build the FN on the ground that was broken up by the split. So what they've done in the 10 years since the 2002 vote is they've rebuilt their electorate, but the organisation, 6.4 million votes is absolutely huge, but there is a gap between the numbers of people voting for the FN and the numbers who are actually in its organisation, and the strength is not as visible as it has been at other points in the marketplaces, on demonstrations and so on, but it still has that vocation to organise on the street, and that's why the FN will also be mobilising on May Day. In terms of the demographic, the two biggest categories for the FN support, given in the studies that have come out, are workers and independent artisans, traders, businessmen, and so on. So generally, the FN vote, in terms of, I think we have to acknowledge that one of the consequences of the shift of the mainstream right towards a much more overtly neoliberal agenda has been that the kind of working class Tory vote, an element of that has shifted to the Front National. We can't get away from the fact that there are workers who vote for the Front National. So in terms of the figures that are going to come out over the next week, I imagine they will show that in the broad category of workers, the Front National scores very, very highly compared to other parties. What studies have shown in the past is that these tend to be people who are not organised. They're not sinking roots into the organised labour movement. And there's a difference between electoral support and their membership, which tends to be much more, it's much higher social categories than workers that form the bulk of their membership. But it is a reflection of a crisis of representation in France, and that crisis takes forms that don't fit patterns that we would always like them to fit. And I think that's why the Front National is making a play for a more left-wing electorate, or a more working class electorate. When Marine Le Pen made her declaration at the end of the first round of the vote, she ended her declaration saying, "Ce n'est qu'un début, continuons le combat." So it's just the beginning. Let's carry on the fight. The slogan from May '68. At her rally, the speakers before her talked about how Gramsci talked about overthrowing the historic bloc, and now it's our turn. Talked about the Republican tradition, that we stand in the tradition of Valmy, the historic battle against the counter-revolutionaries, the tradition of Clemenceau, who defended Dreyfus, the tradition of the resistance. So in other words, this is where, and I'm going to go on too much about this, but the argument about Republican nationalism and the reason why there are aspects of Mélenchon's politics that have proven themselves to be incapable of confronting the Front National up to now, despite his very fine words against the Front National. He attacked the Front National more than any other candidate did. That Republican secular nationalism hasn't been capable of confronting the Front National, because if you've got a model of integration that says citizenship is based on affiliation to values, and that's why it's distinct from ethno-culturalist models of citizenship that are all about white people, basically. Once the right starts integrating the Republican tradition into its narrative, into its the historical legacy that it proclaims identification to, then the ethno-culturalist model also comprises Republican notions of secularism and nationality. So Marine Le Pen says patriotism comes from the right, the idea of the nation and the citizen comes from the left. The Front National stands above both these two traditions. So she's feeding off weaknesses on both left and right to try and present herself as a force that stands above the other parties. Okay, I'll try and deal with everything. I think when I started out, I talked about polarisation. So polarisation means it's not all going the far right's way. There's also a significant vote for the left, and Sarkozy is going to be defeated. In all probability, he's going to be defeated. So that is quite a major. That's quite a major event in terms of the fight against austerity across Europe. That Merkel-Sarkozy axis has been broken. It's the first time since 1981 that a sitting president has been defeated. So whatever the worrying aspects of the vote, and I think there is an urgent need to take seriously the Front National vote and develop the means of, like I say, confronting Islamophobia and the rise of the FN. It's still the biggest combined left vote for many years. So I think the Mélenchon vote. Yes, the polls showed that perhaps he was going to get as much as 14 or 15 or even 17% of the vote, and he ended up with 11%. How can we explain that? They overestimated the Mélenchon vote. They underestimated the FN vote. In the past, when there have been right-wing governments, people tend to vote for the candidate they think is most likely to defeat to defeat the right. Who knows what the considerations that people made at the last minute were? The fact remains there is a considerable vote. That is a massive vote for radical left policies, and I think what it represents is it's part of a process of recomposition of the left in the context of a huge crisis of representation generally that's manifested itself in splits for all the major parties over the past 2 decades, and the inability of the Socialist Party to defend a social democratic project. And Mélenchon is the consequence of that, and the consequence of the search for a political expression of this so-called social movement that's developed since 1995. And there have been various figures who've embodied that movement. Arlette Laguier, the candidate of Le Touvrière, was the first in 1995, and then we had people like Pierre Bourdieu, José Bové, Olivier Besancenot of the new anti-capitalist party, and various organisations as well that have attempted to organise independently of the Socialist Party. So ATTAC would be a good example. ATTAC that emerged in the late 90s, and that was a campaign over the Tobin tax that consistently got called upon to address more questions than simply the Tobin tax. What was their position on the Iraq war? What was their position on whether to vote Chirac or whether to vote Le Pen in 2002? In other words, it was called upon to fulfil some of the functions of a political party. Then there were the collective committees that sprung up in the 2005 referendum and the 2006 movement against measures to casualise youth labour. So there's been a constant, the movement has constantly thrown up new forms and new figures to express the ideas of the movement. And Mélenchon is the latest example of that. I was at the founding congress of the MPA, and it seemed like the new anti-capitalist party was going to embody all those hopes. And I think part of the difficulty in France is one that's shared across Europe, which is how do you develop, how do all the different currents and parties that are involved in the radical left develop an alternative that can first of all punch its weight in elections, and then sustain itself over time, then sustain itself as a party that is rooted in the struggles that take place in between elections, and give consistent political expression to the demands thrown up by those struggles. And unfortunately, the MPA hasn't been able to do that. I think we'll see whether the Left Front can do that. I think one of the differences with previous elections and previous votes for the radical left is that in the past they've been divided between lots of different organisations, Le Touvrière, the LCR, then the new anti-capitalist party, the Communist Party, and so on. There's the fact that there is a bloc now partly explains why Mélenchon was able to punch a much greater weight during the campaign, and his arguments had a much greater effect on the mainstream campaign than we've seen in previous elections. So I think that I'm just looking at some of the other points. Mélenchon really broke with the Socialist Party as a result of the campaign against the constitutional treaty, the referendum on the new constitution for the EU that proposed introducing free and undistorted competition throughout France. And that referendum was won by the No campaign with a mainly left vote against it on an anti-neoliberal basis. The government then turned around and introduced the measures through by Parliament accepting the Lisbon Treaty, introduced about half the measures that would have been in the referendum. And so it was partly as a result of that campaign and discussed with the direction the Socialist Party was going in that you've had this break. Now Mélenchon's model is Die Linke in Germany, and I think it's significant that there has been a break from mainstream social democracy by a figure who used to be a minister, who has brought a number of people with him from the party and then formed this alliance with the Communist Party. Now in France there's always been historically a space to independently of the Socialist Party. The Communist Party used to fill. So it's the biggest vote for a candidate outside of the Socialist Party since the Communist Party vote of 1981, I think. But I think just to try and sum up on the last few questions, I think there is an unfortunate element of the left's blind spot when it comes to Islamophobia that sees the scapegoating of Muslims not as the scapegoating of Muslims but as the defence of feminism, or so there are figures on the left associated with the women's movement who've talked about the progressive nature of the banning of the hijab and the niqab, and you've had people on the left refer to women who wear the burqa as being like birds of death, echoing the language of the Communist Party deputy who referred to the niqab as a muzzle. Sarkozy talked this week about the prisons of cloth that Muslims shut their women away in, effectively, was his argument. And I think there's nothing in the FN's outlook that has progressive aspects towards women. It's an anti-abortion party. It's a very it's a deeply reactionary party on every level. But I think what it's picked up on is this mood of Islamophobia and has emphasised the threat of Islamic fundamentalism that the shootings during the campaign helped them to whip up. I think that there was an interview, I think it was on the Al Jazeera website, where a representative of Muslim associations was saying that there would be a strong vote for the radical left on the part of Muslims in France. I think in reality, the most impoverished areas of France, the banlieue, are areas where there is very little organisation, very little political organisation from the party, on the part of the parties of the left. There is a politicisation taking place in the banlieue, and there are groups that are developing arguments against Islamophobia and against the revival of neo-colonial language. But I think one of the challenges for the radical left, and again this was something that it was hoped the MPA would do, is to make links with the people who took part in the uprising of 7 or 8 years ago in the banlieue. So I think what the election has shown is that the mainstream politicians couldn't escape the crisis. They may have held on and may be able to win the election, whether it's Sarkozy or Hollande. Neither of them is going to provide solutions to the crisis facing French society, and you have forces that are trying to mobilise and trying to gain an advantage in that situation, and the radical left is a player in that, a significant player in that. So I don't think it's an extremely alarming situation, but it's not the situation that we saw in France in the 80s, where you didn't have a significant radical left and you still had the Front National at 4 million votes. So I think it's going to be a question of building movements of resistance, but through those movements, and this is where I suppose there's something to generalise across Europe, through bringing political arguments and ideas into those movements to spread arguments about the need for solidarity and unity across all sections of the population that are suffering at the hard end of the cuts.